New this morning, President Trump is taking his global trade war to the Supreme Court now, urging the justices to overturn a lower court ruling that found that his administration acted unlawfully in imposing many of his tariffs. The ones we're talking about here at issue are those Liberation Day tariffs that Trump announced in April and the tariffs imposed this year against China, Mexico, and Canada that the president had claimed at turns were imposed to combat the flow of fentanyl to the United States. The court found that the president overstepped in leaning on a 1970s era emergency powers law to pull this off. So what now? CNN's Caitlin Polantz is here to explain it all. What is this lower court saying and what's about to happen?
Well, Kate, the lower court just ruled on Friday about this, and the case is moving fast because this is quite important to the Trump administration. They want the Supreme Court to look at Donald Trump's power to put taxes on imports by the fall, early fall. They want an answer from the Supreme Court in just a couple days, and they potentially want this to be argued in November. This case, it's about the tariffs that Donald Trump put broadly on that big Liberation Day announcement against China, Mexico, and Canada. It was what he said, his initiative to combat drug trafficking coming into the country from illegal cartels. And the way that Trump did these is different than other tariffs he levied. He is saying that these tariffs should be something that Donald Trump should do as president under his emergency powers. That's going to be a question that the Supreme Court looks at. Can the president use these emergency powers to put tariffs in place against other countries? The lower court, the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, they said, no, he cannot. And so this question is going to be a very important one now at the Supreme Court because the emergency powers have now been something that the president has tested over and over again in a lot of cases. And what the lower court found here was that Congress alone has this power to put tariffs on other countries. There is a lot of impact in this case potentially as well, Kate. What the lawyer, the primary lawyer for the plaintiffs here says, his name is Jeffrey Schwab, he says these unlawful tariffs are inflicting serious harm on small businesses and jeopardizing their survival. Indeed, it is small businesses, among others, who are suing here. Donald Trump, though, in the Oval Office just yesterday, he said that if these tariffs are wiped away by the Supreme Court, and in line with what the lower courts have done here, it would be devastation for the country. And we do have facts from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection saying that in the 2025 fiscal year, these tariffs alone brought in more than $200 billion. And that potentially could have to be paid back to companies that paid them if the tariffs are struck down. Kate?
Fascinating to see how this unwinds, if it needs to be, and what happens now. Caitlin, as always, thank you so much for your reporting.
Okay, so this is bad for Trump, like really bad. The Supreme Court just heard arguments on his tariff authority, and the justices absolutely grilled his lawyers. I'm not talking about polite questioning, I'm talking about skeptical, pointed, aggressive questioning that signals they're not buying Trump's arguments at all. Justice after justice raised concerns about whether Trump has the legal authority to impose these sweeping tariffs, whether he's exceeded his presidential power, whether Congress ever authorized this, whether emergency powers can be used this way. All the fundamental questions about Trump's entire trade policy. And Trump's lawyers, they struggled. They couldn't give satisfying answers. They kept falling back on vague claims about national security and presidential discretion. But the justices weren't having it. They kept pushing, kept asking for clear congressional authorization, kept questioning the legal basis. And here's what's terrifying for Trump. This isn't a liberal court. This is a conservative court. 6 conservative justices, 3 of them appointed by Trump himself. And even they're skeptical. Even they're questioning whether Trump went too far, whether his tariffs violate constitutional limits on presidential power. The oral arguments happened on November 5th, 2025, and legal experts who watched are saying Trump's in serious trouble, that the justices seemed inclined to rule against him, not unanimously, but potentially a majority, which means Trump's entire tariff system could be struck down, declared illegal, forced to be unwound. We are talking about tariffs on imports from 185 plus countries, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, the foundation of Trump's economic agenda, all of it potentially about to collapse. Because the Supreme Court doesn't think Trump has the authority to do what he's been doing. Now, the case centers on something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA for short. It's a law that gives presidents emergency authority. Trump's been using IEPA to justify his tariffs, claiming there's an economic emergency, that foreign trade threatens national security, that he needs broad powers to respond. But the justices kept asking, where's the emergency? What's the specific threat? Why do you need such sweeping authority? And Trump's lawyers couldn't give clear answers. They kept talking in generalities about fentanyl, about trade imbalances, about protecting American industry. But the justices wanted specifics. They wanted to know exactly what emergency justifies tariffs on virtually every country on earth, on products ranging from steel to sneakers. And when you can't answer those questions clearly, when you can't point to a genuine emergency that requires this level of presidential action, the court starts thinking you are just abusing emergency powers, using them as a loophole to bypass Congress. Making trade policy unilaterally when you should be working with the legislature. And that's a major questions doctrine violation. That's a legal principle that says presidents can't make huge policy decisions without clear congressional authorization. Several justices brought up the major questions doctrine during arguments, asked whether tariffs affecting hundreds of billions of dollars in trade count as a major question, and the obvious answer is yes. Of course, this is a major question. It's one of the biggest economic policy decisions a president can make. So unless Congress clearly authorized it, Trump doesn't have the power to do it. He has to go through the legislative process, get congressional approval. But Trump didn't do that. He just declared an emergency and started imposing tariffs, bypassed Congress entirely, and now the court is calling him on it. If you want to understand why the Supreme Court hearing was a disaster for Trump's tariffs, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to break down exactly what the justices said, why Trump's legal arguments failed, and what happens if the court strikes down tariffs worth potentially trillions of dollars. Alright, so let's dig into what actually happened during these oral arguments, because the details matter. The specific questions justices asked reveal how they are thinking. First, let's talk about IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is the law Trump's been relying on for his tariffs. IEPA was passed in 1977. It gives presidents authority to regulate international economic transactions during national emergencies. The key word there is emergencies. The law is supposed to be used for genuine crises, wars, terrorist attacks, sudden economic catastrophes. It's not supposed to be a general trade policy tool. It's not supposed to let presidents impose tariffs whenever they want by just declaring something an emergency. But that's basically what Trump did. He declared a national emergency related to fentanyl trafficking and trade imbalances, then used that as justification for massive tariffs. And the Supreme Court justices kept asking, is this really an emergency? Or are you just using emergency powers to do what you want without congressional approval? Justice after justice raised this concern. They pointed out that Trump's emergency has been ongoing for years, that it's not a sudden crisis requiring immediate action. If you need tariffs to address trade imbalances, they suggested. Go to Congress. Get them to pass trade legislation. That's how it's supposed to work. But Trump doesn't want to do that. Congress is slow. Congress might not give him what he wants. So he claimed emergency powers to bypass them. And the court is saying that's not how this works. You can't just declare everything an emergency to avoid working with Congress. Second issue the justices raised: the scope of Trump's tariffs. He's not just targeting one country or one product. He's imposing tariffs on 185 plus countries on virtually every type of import, from critical supplies to consumer goods. It's one of the most sweeping trade actions in American history. And justices asked, did Congress really authorize this level of presidential power? Did they intend IEEPA to allow such massive unilateral action? Trump's lawyers argued yes. They said IEEPA gives broad authority, that presidents have discretion to determine what constitutes an emergency and how to respond. But the justices weren't convinced. They pointed out that interpreting the law this broadly would essentially let presidents control all international trade, would let them bypass Congress entirely on trade policy, would make congressional approval meaningless. Just declare an emergency and do whatever you want. That's not what the law intended, multiple justices suggested. There have to be limits on presidential power. Congress has to have a meaningful role. Third issue, the major questions doctrine. This is the legal principle that's probably going to doom Trump's tariffs. The major questions doctrine says that when an agency or president claims authority to make a decision of vast economic or political significance, they need clear congressional authorization. You can't just find some old law, interpret it broadly, and claim it gives you unlimited power to reshape the economy. Congress has to be explicit. And tariffs affecting hundreds of billions of dollars, impacting trade with virtually every country, that's definitely a question of vast economic and political significance. So under the major questions doctrine, Trump needs clear congressional authorization. Does IEEPA provide that? The justices seem to think no. The law talks about responding to emergencies. It doesn't explicitly say you can impose unlimited tariffs on any country for any reason you call an emergency. That's the kind of clear authorization the court wants to see. Explicit congressional approval for this specific type of action. And without it, Trump's tariffs probably violate the major questions doctrine, probably exceed his authority, probably have to be struck down. Fourth issue, the consequences of striking down the tariffs. Several justices asked about what happens if they rule against Trump. Do companies get refunds? How much would that cost? Would it create economic chaos? These are legitimate concerns about the practical impact. Trump's lawyers played this up, said striking down tariffs would cost trillions, would force massive refunds, would create a national security crisis. But other justices pushed back, said the court's job is to interpret the law, not to avoid ruling based on economic consequences. If Trump exceeded his authority, if he violated the Constitution, then his tariffs have to be struck down, regardless of the economic impact. That's the rule of law. You don't get to keep illegal policies just because unwinding them would be expensive or complicated. So the Trump administration's scare tactics about trillion-dollar consequences didn't seem to sway the court. They seemed focused on the legal questions. Fifth issue, alternative authorities. Trump's lawyers argued that even if IEPA doesn't authorize the tariffs, other laws might. Section 301 of the Trade Act, Section 232 National Security Provisions, Section 122 Balance of Payments Authority, various trade laws Trump could potentially use. But the justices seemed skeptical of this argument too. These laws have different requirements, different procedures, different limits. You can't just say, well, if this law doesn't work, and use that law instead. Each law has to independently authorize your specific action. And Trump hasn't gone through the processes required by those other laws, hasn't met their specific requirements, just claimed IEPA gives him blanket authority. So the alternative authority argument probably won't save him. He'd have to start over, impose new tariffs under different legal authority, follow different procedures. That would take time, would create uncertainty, would potentially result in lower tariff rates, would undermine his entire strategy. Sixth issue, the political implications. Several justices seemed aware they're deciding this case in a politically charged environment. Trump's running for re-election. Tariffs are central to his campaign. He's promising dividend checks funded by tariff revenue. And the court has to decide whether to let that continue or to strike down Trump's signature economic policy right before elections. That's an incredibly difficult position for the justices. No matter what they decide, they'll be accused of political bias. Rule against Trump, Democrats will cheer. Republicans will say the court is interfering with a popular president's policies. Rule for Trump, Republicans will celebrate. Democrats will say conservative justices are protecting their political ally. The court can't win politically, so they have to just focus on the law, make the best legal decision they can, and accept the political fallout. Based on the oral arguments, most legal experts think they're leaning toward ruling against Trump, toward saying he exceeded his authority. But it's not certain. The court won't issue a decision for months, and justices sometimes change their minds after oral arguments. So Trump still has a chance. But after those hearings, his chances don't look good. Okay, so let's break down what this means and what happens next, because a Supreme Court ruling against Trump's tariffs would be massive. First, the immediate economic impact. If the court strikes down tariffs, what happens to all the money companies already paid? They'll sue for refunds. Billions of dollars in litigation. The government fighting to keep as much money as possible. Some refunds will definitely be paid, maybe not all of it, maybe not immediately, but the government will lose significant revenue. And future tariff collections? Gone. The $195 billion a year Trump was collecting disappears, has to find other revenue sources or cut spending. That's a huge fiscal problem. Trump was counting on that money for deficit reduction, for dividend payments, for his entire economic strategy. Without it, his promises fall apart, his budget projections fail, his political talking points evaporate. Second, the political fallout. Trump losing at the Supreme Court would be devastating for him politically. He'd lose on his signature issue, his central economic policy, the thing he's been bragging about for years. Democrats would hammer him, say he's been running an illegal trade policy, say his promises were based on unconstitutional actions. And Trump's response? Probably attacking the court, calling them political, saying they're part of the deep state or whatever. That would further erode public trust in the judiciary, further damage institutional credibility, further polarize the country. But it would also make Trump look weak, make him look like he lost. And Trump hates losing more than anything. Third, what Trump could do instead. Even if the Supreme Court strikes down his IEPA tariffs, Trump has other options. He could try to impose tariffs under different legal authorities. Section 232, National Security Provisions. Section 301, Unfair Trade Practices. These laws have their own requirements, their own processes, their own limits, but they do give presidents some tariff authority. Trump could go through those processes, might end up with similar tariffs under different legal justification, might be able to salvage parts of his trade policy, but it would take time, would create uncertainty, would require starting over on the legal and procedural work, and there's no guarantee those tariffs would survive legal challenges either. They'd face their own scrutiny, their own court cases. So even if Trump tries to pivot to other authorities, he's looking at years of litigation and uncertainty, not the stable revenue stream he's been counting on. Fourth, congressional response. If the court strikes down Trump's tariffs, Congress might step in. They could pass legislation explicitly authorizing tariffs, could give Trump the congressional approval the court said he needs. But that's politically complicated. Some Republicans support tariffs, others oppose them as economically harmful. Democrats mostly oppose Trump's tariffs. They see them as raising prices on consumers, as starting trade wars that hurt American exporters. So getting congressional approval might be impossible, might require compromises Trump doesn't want to make, might result in weaker tariff authority than he currently has. And if Congress doesn't act, then Trump's stuck. His tariff policy is dead. His economic strategy collapses. His campaign promises evaporate. Fifth, the separation of powers implications. This case is about more than just tariffs. It's about the balance between presidential and congressional power. If the court sides with Trump, it basically says presidents can use emergency powers very broadly, can bypass Congress on major policy issues. That expands presidential authority significantly, makes it easier for future presidents to act unilaterally, reduces congressional influence. But if the court strikes down Trump's tariffs, it establishes clear limits on presidential power, says you can't use emergency authorities as loopholes. That protects congressional prerogatives, maintains separation of powers, prevents presidents from becoming too powerful. Most constitutional scholars would say that's the correct outcome, that preserving checks and balances is more important than any specific policy. But it creates practical problems, makes it harder for presidents to respond to actual emergencies, creates more bureaucracy and delay. There's a trade-off. More presidential power means faster action, but less democratic accountability. More limits means slower action, but better checks. The Supreme Court has to balance those competing interests, has to decide where to draw the line on presidential authority. Sixth, when we'll get a decision. The court heard arguments in November 2025. They typically issue decisions within a few months of arguments, so we are probably looking at a ruling in early 2026, maybe January or February, right in the middle of election season. That timing is terrible politically. The ruling will dominate news cycles, will influence voter perceptions, will shape campaign narratives. If Trump loses, Democrats will use it against him relentlessly, will say his entire economic agenda was built on illegal foundations. If Trump wins, Republicans will celebrate, will say the court vindicated his trade policies, will use it as campaign material. Either way, the decision becomes a major election issue, shapes how voters think about presidential power and economic policy. Look, the bottom line is this. Supreme Court justices expressed deep skepticism about Trump's tariff authority during November 5th oral arguments, repeatedly questioning whether Congress authorized such sweeping emergency powers under IEPA. Multiple justices invoked the major questions doctrine, suggesting Trump needs explicit congressional approval for tariffs affecting hundreds of billions in trade with 185 plus countries, which he doesn't have. Legal experts watching the arguments believe Trump is in serious trouble, with justices appearing inclined to rule that he exceeded his authority and his tariffs are unconstitutional. If the court strikes down the tariffs, it would force billions in refunds, eliminate Trump's revenue source for promised dividend checks, and collapse his signature economic policy right before the 2026 elections. So here's my final question for you. Should the Supreme Court strike down Trump's tariffs for exceeding presidential authority, or should they defer to presidential discretion on trade and national security? And more broadly, where should the line be between presidential emergency powers and congressional oversight on major economic decisions? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is literally about whether presidents can use emergency powers to bypass Congress on massive policy issues, or whether separation of powers still means something. And make sure you're subscribed, because when the Supreme Court issues its ruling in early 2026, the economic and political fallout will be enormous. Don't miss the coverage.